Gadamer tells us about hermeneutics. Den Text der Welt handelt. It deals with the world. This, he says, happened in the beginning of the... no, he doesn't say that. I'm thinking of that he says in the 20th century, the subject matter of language has become dominant. But what he says is, at some point, I suppose he's referring to in the 1800s and the 19th century, it became clear that the various disciplines who were developing doctrines of methods of textual interpretation were taking their textual interpretation out beyond the text to the world. So in some ways they have far-ranging congeries of knotted reflections on my hands that are hard to weave together into anything sufficiently coherent. But on the other hand, we had the overriding, let's say, dauntless resolution to continually test ourselves in going to the beings and letting the beings show themselves. Heidegger gives a full or perfect explication or hermeneutic treatment of what hermeneutics is, remembering that we always have to go back and think through things afresh, in his text on the hermeneutics of facticity. But I feel like we get something by looking at Heidegger's dear colleague Gadamer, who tells us about the general situation, what was going on. So remember that Leo Strauss says, for us, in the situation we're in, history has become a necessary propedeutic, a preparatory instruction for us. And if we were to read someone who is unaware of what he calls the historical consciousness, our attention would disappear right away. We want to go through history, which Strauss famously calls the second cave, referring to Plato's cave. Plato's cave refers to doxa, or opinions, and the attempt to go from opinions to knowledge, or as Nietzsche understands it, from the phenomena to the truth, which he says is impossible. I was too cavalier in characterizing the Taoist thinking as ontic. That seems to not do. Heidegger gives this, in his typical style of attempting the most exactitude that's possible, after in something that rhymes and echoes with the Aristotelian method of, mathematics it allows as a subject matter for more exactitude than it does the description of oak trees or so. In his attempt to get the proper amount of exactitude with regard to hermeneutics, he lists 5 different moments: engaging, approaching, assessing, interrogating, and finally explicating. I'm not sure how to deal with each of those 5 moments, but one can see that in a cavalier judgment, which could be good intuition in certain cases, we might have to dial back and try to go to the subject matter itself. It's well known that so we're trying to still ask what Dasein is. We're going into some attempt to see if we can see what the hermeneutics of phenomenology is. But at the same time, we're doing some historical reflections, as Strauss tells us we must do, as Heidegger tells us we must do. Um, and in this, one of the things we're doing is comparing the so-called Chinese world, or the Middle Kingdom, to the Western world. So what's well known is that in the place that we call China now, after the modern organization of the PRC, which used to be called the Middle Kingdom and has other names, um, the Yellow River Basin and other things, and it was the territory it's in has changed, of course, given the age-old wars with the Tibetans, for instance, which have in recent times ended in the capitulation of Tibet. It's well known that there's the so-called three teachings, which are sometimes called the three religions. It seems preferable to regard them as teachings, letting teachings be somewhat freer word. We can say that Heidegger has a teaching. We can say that the Catholics have a teaching. Maybe the Orthodox Russian Church has a teaching. The Hindus have various teachings, one of which is the Buddhism, which came to China sometime probably around the birth of Christ. But whenever it was that it got there, some people give it a later date, about maybe the year 200. It came to power, so to what is somewhat lesser known than the obvious three teachings, referring to the Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, is that there was always, in every period, there was a kind of what we can call an intellectually dominant teaching. So about the 4th century, Buddhism became the dominant thing, and that only stopped sometime in the Song dynasty, say around the year 1050 or so, when as is well known, the examination this examination system got up and going, and the so-called Wenren officials, or the literati officials, began to be the dominant intellectual authority in China, and then really that only ended in sometime around the year 1900, when the Western thinking took over, and then of course later on, first with people like Shanghai Sheku, who said such things as only the Germans have anything to teach us, and then later with of course with Mao. Of course, as we already touched on, there were many other influences, Catholic influences especially, since about the 1580s, or late 1580s, 1590 or so. In this sense, I'm thinking now, if we think of these teachings as intellectual powers, we present them in a different way than they were in their organic state. Thinking of them as intellectual powers, then they begin to look more like what I was thinking of, that they're ontic. But if you think of Taoism on an analogy with muthos, and you allow that muthos in the Greek context is a kind of way of thinking. So, for instance, Heidegger is saying, so the word hermeneutic relates to the, it derives from the idea that Hermes is the messenger of the gods. Now, the Hermenus, which also was said of the rhapsodes. Heidegger says that the rhapsodes are called heralds of the gods somehow. So if one looks at in the Greek setting, you can see a kind of thinking, like, for instance, if Hermes, who's the messenger of the gods, who's let's say in our sense is remembering that Heidegger said, die Sprachen spricht. So, die Sprachen spricht. So, language speaks. It's not us who are speaking, but language tells us things. Gadamer says this is one of Heidegger's provocative statements about language. So in the same way that we're talking about letting the beings show themselves from themselves, language is showing itself from itself, and the hermeneutics is letting the language show itself from itself, or letting being show itself from itself, the text of the world, as Gadamer was saying, which I would think would include also the Nick Ted, if that's the way. I don't know if that's the right formulation auf Deutsch, but nothing. In a way, it seems like there's another problem with Derrida's claim that there's nothing outside of the text, unless it's just meant to be a pun, because the nothing is another thing that we can let show itself from itself, and therefore it's one of the things in the world, in the sense of the one is, it's one of those things of that one world, which is the nothing. So nothing isn't outside of the text, it's part of the text. But that being as it may, we would have to know more exactly what Derrida meant there. But here, if you think of Muthos as doing a kind of thinking, so Hermes as taking the dagger to Alexandros or Paris, and forcing him to make this famous judgment at Paris, where he judges between the three fates. And then the thinking comes out that lust or eros, Aphrodite, is the most powerful. And for example, in the Chinese context, the Maoists tried to force their officials to marry the country woman because of the general communist idea of the elevation of the worker, and the worker is the most important thing, and the workers are going to throw off their chains, and the workers are the most people in the country, therefore the country should be run for the workers, therefore the workers should be put their cachet should be increased, they should have more prestige in the country, and everyone should marry a country woman, a peasant, a worker, a real person of the land or whatnot. But this didn't take, because people wanted to marry who they wanted to marry, and they were embarrassed by partially for not necessarily the reason of eros or lust, but they were embarrassed by the country women who seemed less appealing to them. They didn't want to follow the party directives, which were supposedly more rational. But now you can say this whole way of thinking that would make a three-part division between something like lust, eros, or the appetites, like the Platonic, but it's not the same as the Platonic psychology in that it goes from lust, eros, or the appetites to glory or the kalon, or battle, the glory of a warrior's glory, to the highest point, which is that of the so-called landed bandit, as they were later called, those who realized that being a king, King Priam or so, is and settled and married and the head of a rich house, this was more advantageous than being the mobile bandit, or the Mongol type of situation. So you see that there's a kind of thinking in the mythos which is dramatized in Iliad as a whole, which says something about the nature of the world as a whole. And then if you go to the Taoist thinking, you can see maybe there's something similar to that, of a kind of thinking of the whole of the world, what the world's like. It's not exactly representation, in depending on how we think it, but all of this would have to be approached then hermeneutically, and perhaps according to the hermeneutics of facticity, where facticity means the basic thing that Dasein has, what's available to us as Dasein, which would be this movement between things showing themselves as themselves and are grasping the things under as objects, um, which both are there in being. So this subject matter is complex, um, and let's let it be there for the moment and try to let the whole of it sink in, so we can sense the play of it better, and maybe um, let it become more natural. Now we have to go. I suppose the next thing is this question of nature, and what does nature mean in the West, and what does nature, whether we can say there's something like nature in the Eastern thinking, other than in the Eastern thinking, we often have this in Chinese thinking, for instance, in the poetry of China, Tao Xian, for instance, this idea of the division between city, countryside, and mountain, where the sage is associated with the mountain life. And the mountain life is then, we call that nature because it has to do with trees and rocks and things like that, but then this is not really the primary meaning of nature, which is obvious if you think of, for instance, nature in the sense of natural sciences, which refers to everything. But okay, so let's go on in the next. Let's stop for now.